1943. New Nazi superweapons power east. Hitler's last chance to win the war. The Red Army scrambles to defend the Soviet Union, throwing hundreds of T-34 tanks at the gargantuan German Tigers, and the greatest tank battle ever seen. Now, rare home movies show life behind the lines, while newly colorized footage takes us to the heart of the action. Audacious raids, sabotage, and aerial combat. As fanatical SS units attack, the Soviet people must rise up to protect their motherland. Kursk, the ultimate clash of the Titans. German soldier Götz Hertreger has been shooting film throughout the war and is now assigned to a Ministry of Propaganda camera crew. It's an itinerant lifestyle. Wake up, wash up, then check your equipment and head out to capture the latest news from the Eastern Front. Like the arrival of one of a new generation of Nazi tanks, a Tiger. Hertreger rolls film as its 88mm gun test fires. It's a powerful demonstration. Cotton balls in the ears provide essential protection. This Tiger is one of 2,700 German armored vehicles assigned to a vast new offensive in the Soviet Union. 900,000 veteran soldiers prepare for the attack. They'll be covered by 1,700 Luftwaffe fighters and bombers.
The Germans are building up a massive force. They hope that this offensive will regain them the initiative on the Eastern Front.
The driving force behind the German operation is none other than Adolf Hitler. He's counting on his elite units and the cameramen following them to deliver some desperately needed good news. By mid-1943, the Nazis have seized a vast area of Europe, but the previous 6 months have seen the German advance stall and the Allied forces push back. Far in the frozen north, the Red Army breaks the German siege of Leningrad. In the Central Soviet Union, a doomed attempt to take Stalingrad sees almost 1 million German and Italian Axis troops killed or captured. And to the south, American and British armies have blown the Axis forces out of North Africa. Buoyed by the recent Allied victories, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill meet in Casablanca, Morocco. To turn the screws on Hitler, they announced that the Allies will now accept nothing less than his unconditional surrender and plan a joint invasion of Italy.
By stretching the Germans as far as possible in North Africa, in Italy, and potentially also in France, it would give Stalin and the Red Army an opportunity to finally make the decisive breakthrough on the Eastern Front and push towards Berlin.
The string of defeats dents Hitler's swagger.
The Third Reich's expansion has stalled, and the Germans know that they need to change their strategy if they want to win or perhaps even just survive this war.
Hitler is determined to seize back the initiative with a major new military offensive. But first, he must ramp up enthusiasm at home. So the Nazis hold a rally at Berlin's Sports Palace Arena. German newsreel cameras cover every angle as propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels whips a 14,000-strong, carefully selected crowd into a frenzy. He announces total war, the full mobilization of the German economy to support the military effort. Senior Nazi Albert Speer is watching.
Except for Hitler's most successful public meetings, I had never seen an audience so effectively roused to fanaticism.
Energized workers across the Reich rushed to build a new generation of superweapons. The Panther medium tank has advanced sloping armor, a 75mm gun, and a top speed of 34 miles an hour. It sets a new standard for an all-round tank. The heavy Tiger is slow but powerful. Early demonstrations see the 57-ton machine take on trees and houses, destroying everything in its path.
When the Tiger tank appears, its combination of a very powerful gun together with heavy armament means that it can outclass any Soviet tank on the battlefield.
The Ferdinand self-propelled gun is a tank killer. Named after its designer, the car manufacturer Ferdinand Porsche, its 88mm gun is even longer than the Tiger's. This gives its armor-piercing shells increased velocity and a range of nearly 2 miles.
The new wonder weapons are up-armored and up-gunned and gave the Germans a great tactical advantage on the battlefield, as well as a great psychological advantage over the enemy.
Hitler is convinced these devastating new machines will put the Reich back on the path to European domination. He must now pick the spot to unleash their power. 280 miles south of Moscow is the city of Kursk, a major population center and transport hub. In early 1943, the city is newly liberated by the Soviets after nearly a year of brutal Nazi occupation.
Roughly 10,000 inhabitants of the city of Kursk died from malnutrition in the 18 months that the Germans were there.
Landmines and ruined buildings are the Germans' legacy. The city's devastation is obvious. But the Nazis still want it back.
By the summer of 1943, the Germans are finding it increasingly difficult to sustain a very long front in the Soviet Union.
Kursk sits in the center of a large bulge, or salient, protruding 100 miles into German territory.
The Germans' ambition is to remove that bulge so they can release resources by flattening the line.
In Operation Citadel, Hitler plans attacks to the north and south that will link up, reclaim the entire area, and stabilize the front line. His military advisors are keen to attack as soon as the weather allows. But the Führer decides to wait until early July to allow the new generation of tanks time to reach the front line.
Kursk is do or die for the Germans. They're really laying everything they have, all their new weaponry, on a single throw of the dice. If this doesn't work, they're done.
At the Kremlin, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin considers how to react to the impending attack.
In the first 2 years of the war, the most significant successes that the Red Army enjoyed were at the point where a German advance had exhausted itself, and then the Red Army was able to carry out a large counteroffensive on weaker flanks.
Stalin decides to use Kursk as bait in a giant trap. The Red Army will build defenses to stop the Nazis once and for all, then unleash a massive counterstrike. Soviet civilians in the area now become a vital resource. Just 2 months after being liberated from Nazi rule, 300,000 Kursk residents are pressed into service for the Red Army and begin to turn farmland into a fortress. But trench digging is just the tip of the iceberg.
The Red Army is now becoming an army for all intents and purposes of occupation. Not occupation in the same way that the Germans occupy the territory, mind you, but it still needs to be fed. It still needs to be cared for.
Propaganda films show the civilian population taking on all aspects of Red Army rear services, from food supply to medical care. They build a brand new 60-mile railroad to speed hundreds of tanks to the front line. It's German Totaler Krieg versus Soviet Totalnaya Vojna, the total war of half a continent, focused on Kursk. After 2 months of concentrated effort, the fields around Kursk are transformed into a fortified defensive network of trenches, gun emplacements, even dugouts for tanks. One declares for Stalin on its side. The earthworks are so substantial that they are still visible to this day as jagged lines of trees or shadows in the fields. Over 3,000 miles of trenches are arranged in a zigzag pattern to protect defenders from flanking fire and explosions.
Soviet defenses are developed like a spider's web, in which the Germans would struggle, exhaust themselves, and then leave themselves open to a counterattack.
On top of 1.3 million soldiers waiting in the web of trenches, 2 massive Soviet armies hold position to the north and south, ready to counterstrike if they get the chance.
The danger of the Soviet plan is that if the Germans manage to break through the Soviet defensive positions, the Wehrmacht will be able to encircle a large amount of Soviet troops and completely annihilate them.
2/5 of the entire Red Army now waits for the arrival of the new German superweapons. The stage is set for one of the biggest battles the world has ever seen. The Red Army braces for a new German offensive at Kursk. The Nazis are gathering on the edge of the open fields. Stalin sends political commissar and future Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to keep an eye on his generals.
The events unfolding were extremely important. The outcome of the war was being decided, along with the fate of our country.
Later that evening, Khrushchev meets a German deserter who claims he has just been issued with a ration of schnapps. It's a German military tradition. Boxes labeled for frontline fighters in large-scale combat contain candy, chocolate, cigarettes, and matches. They are distributed on the eve of battle. Khrushchev leaves convinced the German offensive is imminent, so the Red Army sends a greeting. Thousands of Katyusha rockets leave their rails at 780 miles an hour with a distinctive metallic howl that adds a shock factor to the bombardment. The Germans are caught by surprise.
The scene was chaotic. Vehicles were on fire and there were several corpses lying in the grass. But we soon recovered.
The attack delays the Germans, but does not stop them. They send a massive artillery and rocket barrage right back at the Soviets. Operation Citadel has begun. To the north of the salient, the German 9th Army moves out. Their aim is to penetrate the defenses and head towards Kursk. In command is General Walter Model. He favors defensive tactics, so decides his tanks and Ferdinand's self-propelled guns will initially hold back.
Having seen the sophistication of the Soviet defenses that he was up against, Model decides to use the infantry to create the breach, and then for the tanks to exploit that breach and hopefully break through to victory.
Thousands of infantry push forward, right into a Soviet minefield.
The Soviets had sown thousands upon thousands of mines. We could never remove all of them, and those that we removed were replaced.
Red Army crews have it down to a white-knuckle science. Get to a gap in the line and dig, fast. Drop in an anti-tank mine, cover your tracks, and get out before a German shell finds you. The Red Army can lay hundreds of thousands of mines an hour. They use the extensive trench network to replenish the fields behind the advancing Germans and swarm at them from all angles.
If you stick your hand into a fire ant mound, the ants will attack you all the way in. As you keep penetrating, your entire limb will be attacked. And so this is the idea. You absorb the attack, and then you destroy the elements that have made the penetration.
The soldiers were deafened by the thunder of guns and mortars and the creaking of tracks. All of the weapons of the infantry entered the battle to repel the enemy.
Such was the sophistication of the Soviet defensive plan. The German infantry found it very difficult to bludgeon a hole in the defenses, and therefore the armor couldn't exploit it.
The Soviet swarm begins to bleed the attacking Germans. Newly restored footage reveals a scouting party, led by Captain Dmitry Zakrevsky, returning from an overnight raid. They're celebrating the capture of one of the feared Nazi tanks.
We found in the tank secret papers, documents. There was also a working radio.
The German officers in the north sense their momentum stalling. But they maintain the offensive to keep the pressure on. To the south of Kursk, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein takes a different approach. He leads with tanks. Brand new heavy Tigers form up into spearheads, flanked by the medium Panthers and an array of older Panzers.
Manstein had seen the very great success that could be achieved by fast-moving armor, creating a psychological impact and a shock impact on enemy defenses, no matter how sophisticated they are.
Many of Manstein's tank crews are drawn from the most experienced and fanatical soldiers Germany has. The military wing of Hitler's personal guard, the Waffen-SS.
The SS is the most fanatical and feared organization in Nazi Germany. They'll stop at nothing to enact Hitler's vision for a new Europe.
In early 1943, newsreel cameras are permitted into the SS training school at Bad Tolz, south of Munich. Here, new recruits are groomed for life in the Waffen-SS, a military organization that fights alongside the regular German army, but reports directly to Hitler.
Hitler doesn't really trust the old elites that you can see within Germany. For example, also the old established officer corps of the Norman armed forces.
SS indoctrination emphasizes Hitler's dark vision of European domination and physical conformity. to mold a fanatically loyal fighting force.
The fact that Hitler builds up the SS means that he has an extremely loyal group of people, up to 900,000, that are loyal to him and no one else.
SS section leader Johannes Schumacher carries a personal film camera throughout the war. He is a member of the Totenkopf, or Death's Head Division. The skull and crossbones on their collars symbolize a willingness to sacrifice their lives for the Nazi cause. Schumacher travels to the Eastern Front. He records the devastation wrought by the SS divisions tasked with controlling the occupied Soviet Union. As villages burn, Soviet civilians forced from the area carry children too small for the march. The SS are always training, ready to wreak destruction.
The SS carry out countless war crimes. They're responsible for atrocities and massacres across Europe. They aren't really soldiering. They're fighting a war of annihilation, of extermination. They're probably as close to evil as the modern world has seen.
As the tanks of the Totenkopf division arrive at the Kursk battlefield, Schumacher uses his home movie camera to film the 57-ton Tigers in close-up. The fanatical SS divisions now intend to use these Nazi superweapons to crack the Soviet defenses. The SS Panzer Corps will spearhead the attack to the south of Kursk. The initial target is a small Russian village named Prokhorovka. 42 Tigers are followed by a further 450 tanks and assault guns across an 8-mile front. It's a slow, methodical advance. But they can take their time. The 5-man crews inside the Tigers are protected by 4 inches of steel armor. To the Soviets, the tanks appear unstoppable.
Shells hit them but bounced off like peas. There have been cases where artillerymen went insane after seeing this.
The tanks plow forward and reach the Soviet trenches. They deliberately use their weight to collapse the earthworks and crush the defenders. German infantry and engineers follow to clear the fortifications.
Dropping into a trench system, my section threw grenades around the corners and into dugouts, which were then cleared out by men with submachine guns.
Soviet footage reveals the Red Army's defensive network beginning to buckle under the attack.
Every time they moved, we shot them. But then we saw that they had a mortar, and before I could open fire, we had been hit. I was a mess, deaf, confused, and unable to stand. I can still recall the mixture of damp earth, cordite, and blood which filled my nostrils.
The German tank advance is relentless. The new models slowly chew their way through the Soviet lines. Soviet losses are huge, 6, 7, 8 to 1 in favor of the Germans.
As the German tanks identify enemy positions, they radio for supporting airstrikes. Waves of Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, known as Stukas, bear down on their targets. Carrying a 550-pound bomb, they drop into an almost vertical dive before releasing with pinpoint accuracy. But to make a dent on the hundreds of Soviet tanks at Kursk, the Stukas need more than just one bomb per run. German newsreel cameras follow Hans-Ulrich Rudel, a Luftwaffe fighter ace who trials a new way of using the aircraft. His custom Stuka is fitted with twin 37mm anti-tank guns. They'll skim the battlefield at a much shallower angle to fire into the vulnerable side armor of of the Soviet tanks.
In the first attack, 4 tanks exploded under the hammer blows of my cannons. In this aircraft, we possess a weapon which is capable of knocking out a formidable number of Soviet tanks.
At Kursk, Rudel claims 12 Soviet tanks in one day. He goes on to become the most highly decorated German service member of the entire war. After 4 days of intense fighting, the methodical approach of the SS Panzer Corps pays off. Their tanks have broken through 3 lines of Soviet defenses and now approach the village of Prokhorovka. Soon they will be in the clear, able to circle back and destroy the remaining Red Army around Kursk. "1,500 miles away, the Allies activate their long-held plan to open a second front against the German army, distracted by events in the east. American Army film cameras roll as the long-awaited invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, begins. 160,000 American, Canadian, and British troops will land on the island and attempt to snatch it from the German and Italian forces. As American cruisers soften up the defenses, landing craft speed to the beaches, most make the troops jump the last yards. But some are duck amphibious trucks. These make a fast, rough landing on the beaches. Allowing troops quick access to the Sicilian streets.
This was indeed an auspicious beginning for the Allied assault upon Hitler's Fortress Europa.
As U.S. infantry clears the fishing town of Gela, it becomes obvious that the German and Italian forces do not have the strength to hold the island. The Allies make plans to move on to the Italian mainland. At his Eastern Front headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler searches for answers.
Operation Husky provides Hitler with a huge dilemma. He could feel his troops being stretched further and further, and he would not only be fighting offensive action by Stalin's Red Army in the east, he would also be fighting the Allies in the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy, and also potentially in France the next year.
But Sicily is a long way from Kursk, where the Red Army can still see the German forces moving toward their jagged defensive lines. They activate their armored reserve. Over 800 Soviet tanks head out to try and halt the mighty Tigers. The greatest tank battle of the Second World War is about to begin. Embedded camera crews film as German tanks approach the town of Prokhorovka on the outskirts of Kursk. They have blasted most of the way through the spiderweb of Red Army defenses. But what they don't know is that they are now entering a giant trap.
Prokhorovka was an ideal place where the Soviets could unleash their armored reserve. It is some way behind the lines where the exhausted Germans could be engaged by fresh armored forces.
As the Germans advance, their scouts send up purple flares to warn of enemy armor ahead. Suddenly, over 400 Red Army tanks break cover. They accelerate straight towards the German lines.
What I saw left me speechless. From beyond the shallow rise in front of me appeared 15, then 30, then 40 tanks. Finally, there were too many to count.
The Soviet T-34 tank is the backbone of the Red Army. It has sloping armor, a powerful V-12 engine, and a formidable 76.2 millimeter gun. But its main strength lies in numbers. By 1943, the Soviet Union's own version of total war sees giant factories far behind the lines churn out hundreds of T-34s every week. They are driven straight onto long trains and sent to the front, a constant stream of armor heading for the battlefield.
By this stage, the Soviet total war industry is easily replacing all losses and indeed increasing the number of tanks day on day that Stalin had available to him. The reverse was true in Germany. Every single German tank that was lost would be very difficult to replace.
At Kursk, the Red Army now tries to use strength in numbers.
The T-34 tank commanders know that they can't compete at long range with German tanks. So they rush towards the German tanks as quickly as possible to fire at point-blank range, because then they know there's then a chance of knocking out a tank.
The T-34s came straight for us at full speed, with hardly time even to fire, as though they had gone mad. I had the feeling of being suffocated by the sheer number of tanks.
As the tanks blast away, the roar of aerial combat fills the sky. Red Air Force fighter, bomber, and ground attack aircraft assault the German lines.
The Battle of Kursk is not just an armored battle, it is an air-ground confrontation that sees a huge amount of air assets used to gain this massive strategic victory that both sides are hoping for.
All day long, planes fired at each other in the sky. There was a hail of splinters and bullets. Watch out. You might get killed by a falling aircraft.
One Soviet pilot above Kursk is a pioneer of the skies. 21-year-old Lydia Litviak is the first woman to shoot down an enemy aircraft in her Yak-1 fighter, and the first woman to claim 5 kills and the title of Fighter Ace. She's perfect for propaganda.
When I see a plane with crosses and a swastika, I have only one feeling: hatred. This feeling makes my hands harder when they are lying on the trigger of machine guns.
The Soviet Union is the only allied nation to allow women to fly in combat. They are eager to show they pass inspection and have a fighting spirit. They'll need it. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment are only given wood and canvas biplanes, crop dusters, but they make the most of them.
As they made their approach, they would cut their engine and fly low to the ground, and the Germans could hear the whistling through the guy wires, and supposedly they struck fear into the hearts of those German soldiers.
We were bombing German positions nearly every night, and none of us were ever shot down. So the Germans began saying, "These are night witches."
The name sticks. The Night Witches go down in legend as a fiercely effective bombing unit. 2 other regiments also engage women as pilots, navigators, gunners, mechanics, and armament specialists.
The regiment consisted of very intelligent girls, graduates of universities and institutes. We danced a lot, made fun, teased each other, and laughed. All of us were obsessed by the idea that our land must be liberated.
Soviet women pilots fly more than 30,000 wartime sorties, a vital contribution to the war effort.
All the women who served in the Red Army, they fought in very much the same way as the men. They were dedicated patriots. They were Soviet soldiers, first and foremost. They were doing what was expected of them.
At Kursk, Lydia Litviak commands her own squadron and takes down at least 3 more German aircraft. But during the later stages of the battle, she comes under Luftwaffe attack. Her Yak-1 is last spotted pouring smoke, pursued by enemy Messerschmitts. Her fate is unknown until 1979, when her remains are identified in a remote village. She is posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Soviet pilots give vital support to the Red Army's massive attempt to stop the Germans at Prokhorovka. The clash is often described as the greatest tank battle of the Second World War, perhaps of all time.
The T-34s were knocking out Tigers at extremely close range. On the black, scorched earth, the gutted tanks burnt like torches.
The battle enters legend. Films show recreated and exaggerated scenes of T-34s storming the German positions. The Soviets claim to destroy hundreds of German tanks. However, the reality is far more one-sided. The elite SS tank crews keep their cool amidst the chaos. They utilize a well-practiced routine. Stop, identify a target, and fire. Reposition, identify a target, fire. Cold-blooded tactics that decimate the T-34s.
Sure, there are losses on both sides, but Soviet losses are far higher than the Germans. The Germans essentially shot up the Soviets.
It was a slaughterhouse of tanks. Everything was enveloped in smoke, dust, and fire, so it looked as if it was twilight. Tanks were burning. Trucks were burning.
By the end of the day, Soviet forces fall back to their starting positions. The Germans reset their lines, retrieving many damaged but intact tanks from the battlefield. High-resolution photographs taken by German reconnaissance planes before and after the battle show the impact on the fields around Prokhorovka. Craters scar the landscape. German soldiers pose for the newsreels among piles of destroyed Soviet tanks. They took out nearly 200 Russian tanks, but only lost 16. Nearly 4,000 Red Army soldiers are taken prisoner, wounded, or killed.
From a tactical point of view, the Battle of Prokhorovka is a complete German success and victory. The Germans only lose a handful of tanks, but manage to inflict very heavy and severe casualties on the Soviet forces.
Hitler is still deciding how to react to the Allied invasion of Italy. But General Erich von Manstein wants to push on. He is convinced that another attack will shatter what remains of the Soviet defenses. Kursk is within his grasp. But to the north, the other German pincer has advanced just 7 miles. It is still stuck in the Red Army's web of fortifications. And the Soviet generals still have an army in reserve. Now they plot a counterattack to crush the invaders once and for all. The Soviet counterstrike starts at dawn. Operation Kutuzov is directed north of Kursk. A substantial Soviet force aims to cut behind the German 9th Army and trap them in the town of Orel. Over 1 million fresh troops follow 2,400 tanks, while shells from 26,000 guns and 3,000 aircraft roar overhead.
Part of the Soviet plan was to husband resources around the northern salient shoulder at Orel. So when the time was right, they could unleash those forces and create a dramatic and decisive counterattack that the Germans would find very difficult to defend against.
The Nazis still have their super weapons on their side. But the sheer scale of the Soviet attack stuns them. The overwhelmed Germans get little mercy.
How should we treat the Germans? We treated them in the natural way. We gave them a proper beating. We hated them bitterly.
There were piles of dead Germans, with map holders and all their stuff still on them. I saw tanks drive over their bodies.
In Germany, Hitler faces the massive Soviet counteroffensive, as well as the Allied invasion of Sicily. He calls off the Kursk attack and orders his SS tank divisions to make for Italy.
The Germans have taken their best shot at Kursk, and it hasn't had any impact. And now there's a Soviet counteroffensive. The Germans have to transition from the offensive into suddenly scrambling for their lives.
As the Germans retreat, they film the enaction of a scorched earth policy, blowing bridges and telephone lines. Metal plows bolted onto trains raised the tracks behind them.
The primary reason to cause all this destruction is to slow the advance of the enemy force. You want to deny your enemy military viability.
Nazi Germany is now on the defensive. Soviet cameras capture the ecstatic reaction of the local population as the Red Army sweep into the town of Orel and shred the remnants of Nazi rule. It's been a painful breakthrough. Over the 6 months since Stalingrad, the Red Army has lost almost as many soldiers as the United States and Britain do in the entire war. The civilian population has been right on the front lines.
The home front is usually construed, certainly in the West, as Rosie the Riveter or rationing cards. But the people of Kursk, they're in this liminal zone between home front and fighting front, and they make significant direct contributions to the military efficacy of the Red Army.
The Soviet Union's vast industrial resources and enormous population have been sorely tested. But the Eastern Front withstands the German onslaught. It's a game changer for the Allied war effort.
Kursk marks the point where the Germans lost the initiative on the Eastern Front. You want the initiative. You decide what to do. The enemy dances to your tune. But for the rest of this war, the Germans are the ones who are going to be doing the dancing.
The Red Army now sweeps west in its own blitzkrieg-style attack.
The Germans were being pushed back into an attritional-type total war that they hadn't prepared for and mentally weren't particularly well suited to. They didn't have the assets nor the psychology to fight in a defensive manner.
As Soviet armies take back their homeland, they film every town. The footage proves to the Western Allies that Germany itself is threatened. The goal of a German unconditional surrender can now be taken seriously. The fight for Europe continues.